Grondas.
Beste luisteraar, ik praat vandaag met de nationalismeonderzoeker John Hutchinson, hoogleraar aan de London School of Economics, over zijn boek Nations as Zones of Conflict, naties als conflictzones. U kent onderhand het gewone discours wel, dat discours waardoor de intellectuele discussie over een mogelijke Belgische staatshervorming wordt gedomineerd. Een discours dat de discussie over de verzelfstandiging van deelstaten zelfs onmogelijk probeert te maken door het onderwerp zelf, meer autonomie voor Vlaanderen en Wallonië, al op voorhand te ridiculiseren. En als dat niet lukt, door het verdacht te maken, als behorende tot de aberratie van het nationalisme en dus tot extremisme dat aan allerlei fobieën leidt. Wie onze kranten een beetje volgt, weet wat ik bedoel. Dat antidiscours berust op enkele simpele uitgangspunten. En die uitgangspunten zijn nu juist het studieveld van John Hutchinson. Het zijn mantra's eigenlijk, die door de altijd durende herhaling ervan ook nog geloofd worden, want om ze aan te nemen is er een diep geloof nodig. Het eerste uitgangspunt is dat identiteiten niet bestaan. Het tweede is dat gemeenschappen verzonnen zijn. En het derde is dat tradities uitgevonden zijn. Nummer 1 over identiteiten is niet het onderwerp van vandaag. Nummer 2 en 3, daarover willen we het hebben. Ze worden meestal samengevat in het parool naties zijn constructies en worden dus aangehangen door de zogenaamde constructivisten. De meeste diatribes tegen regionalisering, tegen devolution in Groot-Brittannië, tegen soeverainisme, uiteindelijk tegen secessie en wie weet uiteindelijk tegen separatisme, denk aan Schotland, Catalonië, Quebec, Vlaanderen, die gaan allemaal impliciet uit van een combinatie van deze drie uitgangspunten. En voor deze drie beweringen beweert men te steunen op wetenschappelijk onderzoek, vooral dan in de nationalisme-studies, want dat is een vak op zich, een vak apart, en het is daarin dus dat Hutchinson hoogleraar is. Maar dat is het hem juist. Dit zogenaamde constructivisme is maar één school binnen die nationalisme-studies. En de meeste autoriteiten die dan worden aangehaald, zoals de Britse historici Eric Hobsbawm en Hugh Trevor Roper, zijn ondertussen achterhaald. Onder meer juist door deze nationalismevorser die ik nu aan het woord laat, John Hutchinson. Ook hij is een zogenaamd modernist, omdat hij natuurlijk weet en erkent dat naties in de geschiedenis een modern verschijnsel zijn, maar...
The problem of the modernists is their tendency to downplay links with the past and a kind of deconstructive or constructionist point of view that nations are nothing but inventions of some kind of process or some kind of new elites who are seeking power.
In our newspapers, in the essays which appear in newspapers, maybe more than in Great Britain, you always see mentioned two expressions in English, and the first is invented tradition, and the second is, of course, imagined communities, whereby imagined is then, on top of it, wrongfully translated as totally invented.
Well, indeed, the point of Benedict Anderson in using the term imagined was to distinguish it from invention. When he was using the term imagined, he simply saying that the ties that people have are not simply face-to-face as in the village, but the nation, like many other presumably ties like class, are with people that you've never seen and perhaps will never meet.
Because you can't gather them all in one single parliament.
That's right, so you, indeed. And he was differentiating that from invention because he thought invention had connotations of falsity. For him, an imagined community is not a false community, it's a real community, but it's produced by certain novel factors like the rise of print culture, the rise of newspapers, and the rise of novels. And
he had nothing against the imagination.
No, very much not.
But Hobsbawm had something against invention.
Well, yes, Hobsbawm, I think, was coming from a Marxian perspective, and so nationalism as a type, almost as a type of false consciousness that people had, and as it were, he was trying to unmask the false consciousness of this, the irrationality of that, in the hope that people would be able to liberate themselves from it and presumably follow the true path towards social democracy or communism. But of course, it's not simply Marxists, but conservatives who are deeply suspicious of nationalism might well, like Trevor Roper in the collection edited by Hobsbawm, has a very amusing essay on the invention of Scottishness.
And of its kilt.
As if it's kilt, yes. But of course, the term invention implies maybe there's a true original, which some other people are fabricating on the basis of that.
So also this expression has two sides.
Yes. Ernest Gellner with Hobsbawm do talk about inventing nations. But there's a curious problem because both Hobsbawm and Gellner set out by saying, well, we can't give a clear definition of the nation at this point. We can only define it after the fact, which leaves us in a quandary. How is it that nationalists can invent the nation if it's so hard to define? Do the nationalists know more than the actual analysts? Or is there something real that the nationalists are building on? There are certain building blocks like having a language, a specific territory, and even maybe ideas or memories of political independence.
Right.
Legends of...
so exactly the things that the modernists want to, and you have pronounced the verb unmask.
Yes.
And they have been spending lifetimes unmasking every possible, what they call, myth.
Yes.
And when the thing is unmasked, then nationalism is still there.
That's the problem, isn't it? Yes. The problem is that these myths are extraordinarily resilient. If one's looking at the histories that nationalists write, of course they're very ideological. But in a sense, that doesn't matter. After all, Christianity has survived for thousands of years.
And it is not true.
Whether it's true or not really doesn't matter. It's whether these myths and symbols answer to something in people. So that historians might deconstruct all they like, but and at one level people will agree with them, but come a crisis, they will turn to these myths. Rather like even an atheist praying to a God he or she doesn't really believe in, if he believes as one of his parents or his child is dying. So people will turn back to these national identities too.
Het lijkt wel alsof ondertussen alle historici mythejagers zijn geworden, mytheneukers als het ware, zelf gevangen in die ene deconstructiemythe van het postmodernisme. Zo wil men per se aantonen dat oorlogen door nationalismen worden veroorzaakt en werden veroorzaakt, er even aan voorbijgaand dat oorlogen er juist waren voor de moderne tijden en dat de meeste moderne oorlogen dan juist imperiale oorlogen zijn geweest. Maar gemeenschappen, intern solidaire gemeenschappen, dat is nu het punt, gaan wel degelijk over een kern van gemeenschappelijke identiteit. En de romantici, volgens John Hutchinson, hebben die helemaal niet uitgevonden. De romantische nationalisten waren er naar op zoek en ze hebben die identiteiten gevonden en niet uitgevonden.
A core of a common identity. And this core can consist of a number of elements. It can be legend, it can be history, it can be truth, it can be falsehood. Doesn't matter.
It matters to the historian, of course, to any analyst, but for the population themselves, as far as its function is concerned, I don't think it does, no. It's much more powerful if you do have architectural remains, say, of some civilization, or if you have Jerusalem, say, in front of you. There you have something solid.
You can't deny Jerusalem.
Yes.
You can't deconstruct it. You can maybe deconstruct it by proving that it was totally rebuilt stone by stone.
That's right, yes.
But also here in these cities which you visit, you can't deny this medieval tower.
Yes, that's right. I mean, of course, an historian will say it was built for religious reasons, not for nationalist reasons, or by feudal warlords or aristocrats. And the nationalists have simply appropriated this warlord as a national hero, whereas in fact he was just a predatory villain. But in a sense, once that appropriation has taken place, it takes on a life of its own. And then the more that symbol is used, say, in the history and culture and art and theatre of a population, then it becomes real as a kind of national symbol.
You call that altogether a kind of thesaurus.
Yes.
Or a bank, you say.
Yes.
It's a bank.
Yes. one of the things that gives nationalism its power are the role of, say, cultural figures in building on a stock, and then you find a whole culture being built around that. And I give the example of the Kalevala, this epic poem in Finland, how it inspires Sibelius, and then it inspires a whole range of painters to go off to the Caribbean landscape. And so even if at some point, say the Kalevala was actually put together by Lönnrot from all these scattered verses and made into a unified epic, in a sense it doesn't really matter, but you still have Sibelius and so forth. So you still have your national culture, which is...
And even then, in this case of the Kalevala, the trials to unmask it as untrue, unreal, were vain. It did exist in a way.
Yes.
In the mouth of peasants.
That's right.
On the Karelian border.
Yes, that's true. Another point that people like Hobsbawm don't take into account, that many of these folk scholars themselves, it's assumed they were inventing something, but they themselves actually believed somewhere out there was this body of legends that expressed the folk, and when they saw these scattered things, they assumed this was part of a unified whole. They didn't see themselves as inventors. They saw themselves as simply editors putting back together
scattered remnants
into what they thought was an original.
Even the English folklorists, inspired by the Germans in the 19th century, believed that kind of thing. Culminating in Andrew Lang, who then, very German-inspired, collected the English folk stories.
Yes, they were romantics, and many romantics believed there was a kind of sacred energy or identity in the land, in the culture of the folk who lived on the land.
And in the landscape.
And the landscape. So they went out to find, they went out on what were voyages of discovery to see where these sources were. And of course, people like Wordsworth found the Lake District, and other Irish writers found the west of Ireland, the Irish-speaking parts. And
the Gael talked.
And the Gael talked, yes, that's right. And you've got many equivalents in other countries. And for them, it was a revelation. They felt, as it were, transformed. So it was a quasi-religious experience for these people. They weren't going out as manipulative inventors. They were going out really to find something, certainly, but as almost a quasi-religious quest.
It replaced religion when religion itself was on its way in its secularistic downfall.
Yes, initially many of these, particularly the cultural figures, literary figures, philologists, search for something else, and they find it in these romantic remains.
But that doesn't mean they were stupid.
No.
They were rather rationalistic.
Well, indeed, many of them are highly original and intelligent thinkers, and they engage.
Think about freedom.
Yes.
Like Schiller, like Wordsworth, like Coleridge, like Shelley, who was a leftist.
Well, indeed, you get romantics, as it were, discovering the Indo-European language system. So
the philologists.
So many of them were formidable intellectuals, but they had all kinds of bees buzzing in their heads, which were driving them on. They believed there was some kind of great world spirit which manifested itself in different ways in different cultures. Their task was not only national, but particularly many of these early intellectuals, they believed it was their duty to revive incarnations of this world spirit in all the local cultures. So many of the British scholars in India, for example, were fascinated by Aryan India and believed it was their duty to revive this great Indian civilization.
So they were at the same time globalists.
Globalists, yes, it was a global phenomenon. Anti-Orientalist, if you like, insofar as they believed that the sources of European civilization were not necessarily in Europe, but could be from outside in the East, the mystic East. And so India was the mother civilization.
And then you could revive things like in the Eastern origins back home.
That's right. Yes, indeed. That you could find equivalents in back home, and so Theosophy, for example, which believed itself that originated in the East, but nevertheless.
Madame Blavatsky.
Yeah, that's right. But you could find it also in the folklore of the Western.
And Yeats.
And Yeats, yes.
Yeah.
So it inspired great creativity, and some of the greatest composers, writers, artists.
Het punt is nu dat nationalisme een eerder impliciete ideologie is die zich op de andere bekende ideologieën zoals socialisme en liberalisme kan enten. Vandaar dat, tot grote verbazing van velen, nationalisme evengoed links als zogenaamd rechts kan zijn en dat inderdaad vaak ook geweest is. Daarom is het constructivistische uitgangspunt nogal banaal. U hoort nog altijd John Hutchinson.
So they were not stupid, they were rationalists, they were globalists, they were immensely learned. And still, modernist historians blame them for their stupidity in inventing nationalism. As if they could just, by a fillip of their fingers, say, let nationalism be.
Yes. Yeah, there's a general condescension to nationalism, I suppose, because like much of Romanticism, it tends to disregard the intellect in favor of the imagination, of the emotions. So things are said indirectly through symbols. So implied. So unlike, say, if you're a Marxist, you can read these heavy and certainly very abstract tomes by Marx and Engels and all kinds of other followers, or a follower of liberalism. They're very
Adam
Smith, John Stuart Mill, and so forth, highly articulate. There aren't really the equivalent in the field of nationalism, largely because again,
you don't need to.
It's
just belong.
Yeah, but belong. Yes, it's an earthier. It's a much earthier ideology. As I say, it involves the imagination and the emotions, rather than highly abstract doctrines. And in part, that explains why it's so adaptable to almost every terrain, so that nationalism can ally with liberalism, communism, fascism, anarchism, and just about anything else.
And then afterwards, it is blamed for the outrages of liberalism, anarchism, fascism.
Yes. But in a sense, nationalism works both ways, like religion itself. It binds people to a solidarity, and it binds people through a love of that solidarity. Yeah. So the literature and the culture and the idealization of heroes from the past is about expressing the love of the community, its valorization compared with others. But at the same time, any strong community creates boundaries against outsiders. And so at times of crisis, yes, you can get this xenophobia as well. But in a sense, that's like any other type of belief system.
Like religions, that's also the we and the they.
Yes. And of course, socialism has its class enemies. And
your constructivists say this is all construed. Construed in a number of ways, but your answer will be you can't construe and neither construct if there are not elements to construct.
Yes, indeed. The term construction is quite ambiguous, but in a sense, because we are human beings and thinking human beings, and we are making and remaking our world, everything is a construct, including families. That's banal, though, but that's not saying anything specific about nationalism or anti-nationalism. Do we construct like we're engineers building a bridge very deliberately? We've got on purpose, yeah. In a sense, language is a construct, but it's rather different from a bridge. It's a kind of evolution. People are building it and rebuilding it, but they're...
it's got something organic.
Something organic to it.
Here we are romantic.
I don't think one needs to go back to that, but in a sense, the nationalists are drawing on, if they're going to be effective, they have to be able to draw on sentiments.
Which are there.
Which are there.
And which have a persistence. There is a persistence of what we now call proto-nationalisms and proto-nationalist feelings.
Yes, undoubtedly. So there is a lot of imaginative weaving by nationalists. They're saying things that they wish to be there and are there, but they're building on sentiments, and their story has then to be plausible to the audience or constituency to whom they're sending these messages. Mm-hmm. And of course, it will get modified. There are always different versions of the nation that are being put forward, so that some will be taken up and some will be rejected.
En dat is precies de betekenis van de titel van John Hutchinson's recente studie, Nations as Zones of Conflict. En deze discussie binnen de natie, zeg maar binnen Vlaanderen, over hoe het verleden nu te evalueren, doet aan die natie zelf eigenlijk weinig af. Integendeel, ze versterkt ze zelfs, volgens John Hutchinson dan. Over de Vlaams-Belgische geschiedenis zou dit hoofdstuk nog moeten geschreven worden, maar Hutchinson geeft voorbeelden uit de Britse geschiedenis, met de tegenstelling tussen de Normandische en de Anglo-Saxische tradities, en uit de Russische geschiedenis, met het debat tussen Slavofielen en Westersen.
And you say that this being taken up, being rejected, this discussion about the core, about the identity, about the essentialism of this identity is a good thing. It's the discussion itself, which does not minimize the truth or the effectiveness of nationalism. On the contrary, it reinforces it, and that's something new. That's something I never read before.
I think within any heritage, there are different versions of heritage, because there are different historical episodes which mean things of importance to people.
Which run parallel to different historical layers of populations.
Yeah.
That's also interesting, because what I didn't know or didn't quite realize that the Norman tradition in England persisted for so long. And the Anglo-Saxon tradition was taken up centuries after, and that it was a kind of two currents.
Yes.
And that was important. They make distinctiveness. And both have their stories.
Yes, indeed. Just like the Franks and Gauls in France, Norman British, I suppose, Anglo-Saxon, but nevertheless, there are different themes or versions of the nation that are taken up when one group conquers the other, but the defeated version has also often a subterranean
lingers on.
It lingers on, and to the conquerors may decide, as in the case of the Normans, as it were, that they have to recognize or accommodate the regime to these Anglo-Saxon versions of what kingship should be.
Yeah, that's what happened.
Yes, and these traditions then can be used later in different contexts, say in the attack on royal authority by the parliamentarians leading up to the Civil War, when they look back to Anglo-Saxon liberties against what they see as Norman traditions of monarchical despotism.
Yeah, and Norman feudalism against the free King Alfred.
That's right, and of course it gets taken up still later by radicals seeking the extension of the vote and attacking a Norman aristocracy and saying, well, yes, it's still Anglo-Saxon liberties, the people still haven't been emancipated.
So what you want to say with this is that there are two different interpretations and story layers of the same nation, but that this discussion is not detrimental. On the contrary, it reinforces.
Well, indeed. Again, another example is the debate in Russia about whether Russia is fundamentally a European society or is something quite distinct based on its Orthodox traditions. And so there you get debate between the Slavophiles who say, well, Russia is quite separate from Europe. It's got this huge landmass. It's never developed a kind of absolutist state like Europe. And it's the role of orthodoxy, the role of the land, and
the Russian soul.
And the Russian soul, yes.
Which will save
and
Europe.
Save. Whereas the Westerners say, well, this explains Russian backwardness. It's cut itself off from the great traditions of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. And
so let's build St. Petersburg.
That's right. And Peter the Great was the first person who really saw this. Peter is the true epitome of the Russian. And now in this debate, you get different sides, but as a result of this debate, you get a sense that Russia is both, there are elements in Russian society which are European, and there are also elements that are simply not European. And as these sides debate each other, they begin to recognize and have to qualify their position. So they recognize that Russia is distinct in some ways. It reinforces a sense of Russian distinctiveness, because the Westerners are saying, if only we were like Europe, but we can't be. There is this...
So in the end they agree.
Yeah, they do. There's often a switching between
Even
sides.
Dostoevsky, in the end, agreed with himself.
Yes. Well, that's right. But they will emphasize one thing rather than the other. At certain points they'll say Russia, in order to progress, must modernize itself more, and this will justify borrowing ideas from France or England or Germany or England. At other times, saying, well, our society is simply being swamped by foreign ideas, and it's demoralizing, losing touch with your traditions. And you see this being played out in post-Soviet Russia. Yeltsin was something of a Westerner, and he brought over all these economic experts to try and transform Russia in a trice into a kind of modern economy, and it was a disaster. And so you got this reaction, a kind of Slavophilic reaction to say Western liberalism is no better than, or liberalism is no better than socialism, because they are both an onslaught on Russian traditions. We've got to build up Russia as a separate civilization.
Maar je ziet dit fenomeen ook in Frankrijk, met de verschillende tradities die zich beroepen ofwel op de Galliërs ofwel op de Franken. Iets wat in de Asterix-serie uitmuntend wordt gedocumenteerd.
So again, the result is the result above all of this to and fro.
Yes, indeed. And in France too. Monsieur Le Pen's not a very happy representative of the notion of an ancient Catholic France, but nevertheless, you have this division in France as well between those
who sometimes recur to the same symbols.
It's interesting that French republicanism at first, in its revolutionary phase, denied completely the worth of the Ancien Regime. But after the Restoration and after the excesses of the Jacobin democracy, they had to try and found republicanism and something of a broader appeal. So they looked back to the Middle Ages and St. Joan. But of course, this was contested by Catholics who said St. Joan is ours. She's a loyal servant of the Church and also of her king. So
and then you see Charles de Gaulle's symbol, the Croix of Lorraine.
Yes. So initially, there's a lot of battle between who owns St. Joan, but it enables both factions to unite in the First World War in response to the German invasion.
Right, because there was a crisis.
Yes, and indeed in the Second World War, she becomes a figure of unity for communists, for Republicans, and for conservatives.
The core rests on a sense of cultural distinctiveness.
Yes.
Above this discussion, what the symbols will mean.
Yes, the symbols are only means to tapping into this sense of distinctiveness. And at times of crisis, say when the state has been swept away, say in war, and you're being occupied,
defeat.
Yes, then and when you're left with nothing of the institutional structure of the modern nation, people are left to ask, well, what is bedrock? Where can we find meaning? And they look back to the past to find inspiration, to find meaning.
And they fill this past and these symbols with their own contemporary meanings.
Yes.
But the receptacle is good, isn't it?
Yes. Well, the receptacle, has a power, and they may start out by reading contemporary meanings into it, but then because they're going back to the past to find inspiration, they are expecting the past to speak back to them.
Past, speak to me.
Yes. At times of crisis, they may say, well, one of the most powerful reservoirs of tradition was the church, was religion. And they look to the great Gothic cathedrals of France, and they say, well,
Fille aînée de l'Église.
Yes, indeed. Often this will lead them back to religion, so they become traditionalized.
Even if they don't believe.
Well, they may believe, but they may believe for national reasons. That's the
Right.
thing. That the church is an essential part of the heritage of the nation. It isn't that a true believer will simply say, well, the faith is universal. The nation is neither here nor there, or at best, the nation is but an instrument of the true faith. But for the nationalists, they may go back to religion, but they'll say this is one of the most perfect expressions of our national genius. For example, Arab nationalists who want to find an independent basis other than Islam will simply say, well, Muhammad was part of the creative genius of the Arabs.
Of this peninsula.
That's right, and he's perhaps our greatest representative of the Arabs, but also we had scientists, also we had doctors and great doctors, so it's as a way of relativizing religion.
Het geheel van al die symbolen, zelfs onderling tegensprekelijke symbolen, komt voor John Hutchinson samen in een zogenaamd etnosymbolisme.
Is that what you want to say with ethno-symbolism?
Yeah.
What does the ethno-symbolism do? Does it combine the ethnos and the demos?
Well, that is, of course, the goal of nationalists. Of course, ethnic identities may have only been maintained by certain groups in the society. Anthony Smith makes a distinction between lateral and vertical ethnies. There are societies where the monarchy and the aristocracy are the significant representatives of the ethnic. These tend to be great powers, and the aristocracy sees itself as an honorific group which develops a sense of Frenchness, for example. In some smaller societies like Ireland, they identify themselves more in religious terms. They are the people of St. Patrick who helped convert Europe. And this is a more demotic, he says. So in Ireland, the notion of ethnicity goes further down the ranks. With modern nationalism, they're trying to construct modern apparatus using these ideas and sentiments. In some contexts, these sentiments will be spread right through the society, or it'll be fairly easy to mobilize people. In others, you're mobilizing the people from above, and so he makes this distinction. In France, there's a certain sense of Frenchness amongst the elite, but maybe much of the peasantry are outside this.
Right.
And Eugene Weber suggests that in this famous book, Peasants and the Frenchmen. So,
Means that nationalists in their project, when they know what they are doing on the spot, have to choose between these conflicting interpretations of the past.
yes. Well, you get often many different versions of what the past might be. So one version of the past put forward, say, by the aristocracy or the middle classes may not strike very many roots amongst the peasantry, who may value some bandit figure as may see this as a better representative of the nation. Robin Hood, yes. So often as different groups get mobilized as a result of modernization, you get different strands of nationalism coming into play.
The tradition which refers to the Roundheads and to Cromwell is very, very English.
Yes.
As is the Cavaliers.
Yes. People still engage in reenactments of the Civil War, as it were. These still capture people's imagination.
Because the strands maybe still exist.
But what's interesting is that strands can be taken up in so many different ways. For example, the notion of Anglo-Saxon liberties can be taken up by radicals, but it also can be taken up by conservatives, because Anglo-Saxonism versus Normanism can be saying, well, there's a kind of value in English insularity. All bad ideas come from the continent, like the Normans. They impose despotism on us. England is unique. Because of these Anglo-Saxon liberties, it's been able to develop parliamentary liberties, but you haven't had strong kings like on the continent.
They were raised on the shield.
Yeah, with standing armies. So, of course, conservatives, when they're opposed to the European common market, who talk about our Anglo-Saxon liberties. Both Tony Benn, who looks back to the Levellers in the English Civil War, a very radical group, who wanted to overthrow monarchy and even believed in, you might see them as early communists, early socialists. And Margaret Thatcher would be using almost in the same year. They would still be talking about Anglo-Saxon liberties. He'd be meaning something radical. She'd be talking about the tradition of parliamentary liberties, which distinguished Britain from her continental friends.
Yes. Referring to the same symbol.
Yes, yes.
En dit alles, die hele machinerie van dat etnosymbolisme, wordt dan herinterpreterend ingezet bij elke periodische herleving van het nationalisme. Want het zal u al opgevallen zijn, het nationalisme leidt inderdaad aan revivalism. Het herleeft telkens weer.
Now and then, nationalism seems almost absent. When the news and the politics of the day are in the sign of transatlantic relations, then there is maybe in England, only to speak about England, not much room for so much nationalist feelings and for a flag with only one cross instead of three. And then again, it comes back. And that you devote a couple of chapters on that phenomenon of revivalism.
Nationalism is what I would say is a kind of episodic phenomenon.
Recurrent.
Recurrent. It waxes and wanes. So that as when nationalists seem to achieve their goals, nationalism often retreats. Nationalism and national identities are only one amongst multiple identities.
They make themselves superfluous when they reach their goal.
When they appear to reach their goals, the goals are self-government, cultural distinctiveness, having a homeland of your own. But of course, there are many other goals that people have, and they may divide over whether they're liberals or socialists, whether Catholics or Protestants, and so forth. And all of these things are important to them. So that these things are important alongside their national identity. So when the national goals appear to be achieved, people often switch to other things. It doesn't mean that nationalism or the national identity has disappeared. It's still working away, but in a banal form, to use Billig's term.
It's not to the fore anymore.
It's not to the fore. People have families, so these occupy the minds. Yes. And so it's only really at times of crisis again that when, say, there's a threat coming from outside, either threat of war or sudden influx of people, which is
migration. In other words,
migration, and then this triggers a sense of threat, and then this threat is much broader than one's family attachments or even one's class attachments and so forth. And so this a kind of national identity.
People start to mobilize.
Mobilize, yes. Yeah. And so they, again, try to draw boundaries against the threat, either against the migrants or against the foreign enemy. It appears to be the gates.
Or against the organization of the state, as it is, which seems to defavorize them.
Yes, or against some kind of ideology which seems to be undermining, or indeed some economic development. If someone is planning to build Disneyland on the Champs-Élysées, that would certainly get the French mobilizing.
Right. What do you see then? Revivalists.
Yes. Well, yes, at these times of crisis, people then have to sort of, because, as it were, the national identities have become latent, and the original nationalism is no longer relevant to the new situation. So people have to think, well, what in our past or what in our culture can be used in order to devise a response to this threat.
So they go back to the famous old bank of symbols.
That's right, yes.
Take something out there, reinterpret it, and present it to the present.
That's right, yes.
Have you got examples of that recently? Hooligans?
What is interesting is a revival of English nationalism.
Right. Jeremy Paxton.
Jeremy Paxton, yes. And it's in response to a number of things. In part, it's the European Union, but of course you could say, why don't they just simply express their Britishness? In part, it's because a Scottish nationalism, and even to some extent a Welsh nationalism, is threatening to dissolve Britain as a united kingdom, as a united parliament.
The only English are the Northern Irish.
Yes, well, but even they would call themselves British rather than English.
So the English feel threatened
Yes.
or minorized by A, Europe, B, devolution.
Yes, and also they're threatened, I suppose, by the problems of large-scale industrial life. Anyway, the growth of the state. So
By these dark satanic mills.
satanic mill. So there is this recurring trend in England to the real England is in the shires, in the countryside, not in London. London is a big
The real
capital.
England is the Shire by Tolkien.
Yeah. Oh well, yes, indeed. I think that accounts for a lot of the popularity of someone like Tolkien. This extremely romanticized
The English landscape.
landscape.
Like,
yes, with all these magical beings.
Yeah.
It's
It's
a place
the
of,
land.
place of wonder. Yeah.
Absolutely, and it's the land,
Yes.
It's like with Roger Scruton.
Yes.
He also
Yes.
makes a eulogy of the land.
Yes. In that respect, this is a form of nationalism. It may not be explicitly so, but nationalism is a form of re-enchantment. Because Weber talked about the disenchantment of the world as a result of bureaucratization, capitalism, rationalism.
Secularization.
That's right. And he despaired. He said, well, where can we find the sources of charisma in the modern world? And he talked about the iron cage after the loss of religious values and religious virtues. And he talked about the world fleeing ideologies such as romanticism. So he didn't see any real hope in romanticism. But Weber himself was a nationalist not necessarily a very nice kind. He was a power nationalist, but nationalism is an ideology which does re-enchant. It does emphasize the importance of the land, of culture, and so
And
forth.
that's where people live.
Yes.
That's the bottom.
Yes.
That's
Indeed.
the bottom line under their feet.
Well, indeed. And so you find many of these cultural nationalists dabbling in all kinds of strange things, mystical movements, heritage. They become druids or interested in witchcraft.
Stonehenge.
Stonehenge, yes.
It's more than that.
Yes.
You are somebody who does something against the ridiculization of all this.
Yes. Well, I think it's true that some of these romantics were quite bizarre, but it wasn't the bizarre that made them important. That's the thing. Yeats was a great poet, and the route through which he reached his greatness as a poet might have been very strange, but that's not what's important. It's actually the poetry and the plays that's what resonate with people. And it's the ability of the Romantics to conjure up extremely powerful feelings and images.
Cultural nationalism, somewhere you write that it's a moral innovation.
Yes.
It's moral.
Yes, I'm using moral in perhaps a sociological sense, insofar it's trying to reconstruct the fundamental ideas and sentiments through which society is organized.
That's moral. Okay.
Yeah, and it's an innovation in a sense that cultural nationalism is often seen as a regressive thing. This looking back to golden ages is often seen as a kind of retreat from the complexities of the present. And people,
Right, so postmodernists say if only culture could be abolished.
Yeah, well, that's right. And the assumption is, well, these are just dreamers. They've got no significance. In my interpretation, the golden age is being used to change the definition of the existing society, because cultural nationalists emerge at times, they tend to emerge at times of crisis because of the impact of modernization on traditional modes of being. Society is often split between those who want to conserve tradition at all costs and those who believe that, well, tradition is simply, if you conserve tradition, you're going to simply destroy the society, rather like the case of the Chinese under the impact of westernization. You could divisions between those who want to westernize or those who
Same
want
as with the Slavophiles.
Yes, and keep Confucian tradition. Yeah. And the cultural nationalists come in as a kind of reconciling force. They argue that if you get rid of all tradition, then you demoralize people because their self-worth disappears with it. All they can be is imitators. On the other hand, if you reject modernization or innovation, then the society will surely die because it will simply be unable to stand up.
Because history is changed.
That's right. They say the nation, as it were, can be an integration of tradition and modernity. We have to modernize on our own terms. In other words, tradition has to be changed, but also we select those most things valuable in what is new, what are the new developments, which are going to build up a strong society. So the golden age is used as a way of showing that at certain high points in the society, there was a respect for tradition and also powerful innovation. So in the case of, for example, Indian nationalists look back to Aryan times and they said, well, India was not only a society embraced by faith, but it was a great scientific, mathematical innovator, and it taught the Greeks. So looking back to the Golden Age, so we were an innovator, we taught all the other civilizations, so it's no shame to borrow from the advanced societies because they took from us.
Yeah, right.
And so the attempt, as it were, to harmonize the traditionalists and modernists and bring them into a coalition to build the nation together.
And that is moral.
That's the moral implication, moral innovation, insofar as they're changing the terms in which people think.
All this leads to one conclusion, which is at the same time your point of view at the beginning already. It's difficult to imagine a world without nations.
At the moment, yes. I mean, it's many say we're coming to the end of the nation state, but we see in the current phase of the world, in fact, increase of nations.
Difficult
and
to see where an
states.
alternative for nations can be found.
Well, yes, the major alternatives that are on offer by and large have failed. I mean, communism failed, and arguably it was always based on a notion of nationality. Certainly the Soviet Union, that always underpinned
Communism, federations are shaky.
Yes, federations are shaky, and by and large they have to be built on the values of a dominant nation anyway if they're going to succeed. But here you see that even in such benign circumstances, nationalism raising its head and creating extremely difficult problems for the Canadian state.
Yes, to say nothing about Belgium.
Well, to say nothing about Belgium. But you see, if the constructionists were right, it would solve Belgium's problems. You could simply construct by some means or other a Belgian identity and everyone would be happy.
Right. The Belgian state has been a very bad pedagogue. If this were this multiculturalist paradise, which provides for everybody, that they haven't been able to construct this identity. It is not there.
Perhaps the constructionists are the ones who put forward fairy tales.
Een probleem ontstaat alleen maar als deze constructivistische sprookjesvertellers van hun verhaaltjes ook politieke munten willen maken. Want dat leidt toch maar alleen tot valsmunterij. John Hutchinson, Nations as Zones of Conflict, is uitgegeven bij uitgeverij Sage.